Andrew Jackson is certainly one of the most prominent presidents in the history of the United States of America. As the 7th president, he made many great strides towards equality for the common working class American. This can be seen in many of his efforts, namely the Indian Removal Act, Nullification Crisis, and of course, the Bank War. As the 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson was both a successful economic and political advocate for the common man because of the Indian removal. Although the Supreme Court was against the Indian removal, Jackson still pushed for their removal. This can be seen by the common man getting more land, a feeling of safety, and a reduction of taxes. Andrew Jackson was an advocate for the common man by removing the Indians. The idea of Indian removal started out during the Jeffersonian era. Jefferson had been convinced that too much land for the Indians was a bad thing. They were so far apart that they had no reason to become civilized. When they used the land, they'd been deemed wasteful and uncivilized, and he thought that he could turn the Indians into farmers, but failed. When Andrew Jackson became the president, he wanted the Indians to be removed so that the common man could go and use the valuable land for things such as farming and industrializing the country. This was like when the Mongols invaded China and India. The Mongols would want to go to conquer land and use it for colonizing. Opposing these thoughts were the Supreme Court. They saw the Indians as a nation, and therefore they couldn't just force them out. They had to negotiate between nations. At the end, the Supreme Court lost, and the Indians were divided into tribes and were not joined as a nation, and therefore Jackson's argument was valid. In Document 1, it also proved that Indians were not considered as a nation because they were below the whites, and therefore the whites had control over them. This helped the common man a lot as they could now advance into the industrial era. The common men favor Andrew Jackson as he removed the Indians, and another reason why was he put the common men out of danger. The Supreme Court had considered the Indians a nation, and therefore could not forcefully remove them, as seen in Document 2. As the Indians talked about the treaties and securing themselves against intruders, the Supreme Court was not for Indian removal. It can also be seen that the Indians were threatening the Supreme Court, for they started talking about securing against intruders, and the intruders were the common men. Andrew Jackson took this as a threat, and therefore he wanted to move them out of the West, and more specifically, west of the Mississippi. This was like when Jamestown was founded, and the Indians were attacking the whites. This caused Bacon's Rebellion, and a lot of Indians died. So the first war was the Black Hawk War, in which the Indians were defeated and forced to move, and this put the common men that are close to these Sauk and Fox Indians feel safer. There were still more tribes out in the South, which are the 5 civilized tribes. This time Andrew Jackson did negotiate with the southern tribes, and thus, from asking of the state and federal governments, the Indians were seated in the West. This led to another of the Worcester versus Georgia, where Worcester was a missionary, and it was illegal for whites to reside with the Indians. In the third attempt to cross Indian land, he was sentenced in jail for 4 years. Along this was the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. The Indians were moved, and many died along the way. This can be seen that politically that the government and the state were working together for the good of the common man. Andrew Jackson was an advocate for the common man when he removed the Indians. This can be seen by the reduction of taxes for the common men. During the 1830s, the Federals had to pay the Indians $68 million. Even though this sounds bad for the common man, it isn't, because the common men get lots of land that's good for railroads, farming, and living. In Document 3, it talks about how Jackson vetoed the Maysville Road, but in the contest, he was talking about paying off the debt, and at some point any oppression in the land would be gone, and that the benefit for the common men was that they would be able to keep more of their money. Since they have the Indian land, they will also be able to go out there more into the West and prosper. The common men were for Andrew Jackson because of the Indian removal. By removing the Indians, they got more land, a feeling of safety, and a reduction of taxes, and with this, they said that he was a successful economic and political president. During his presidency, Andrew Jackson began and continued many movements for the betterment of the common American. This can be vividly seen in the Bank War, where, although it angered many of his opponents, Andrew Jackson stood up for the common man through reducing the power of the wealthy, fending off harmful tariffs, and increasing economic potential between the classes. President Andrew Jackson was a major opponent to the extremely wealthy upper class. These were the people who effectively owned the government and country as a whole through the national bank. Jackson believed in having the power concentrated around the people, not the elite. It was for this reason that he tried valiantly to destroy the national bank in favor of many smaller ones, an effort that was given the title of Bank War. This conviction is well portrayed in Document 5, a quote from Jackson himself. Within this document, he states his logic behind vetoing the recharter of the United States Bank that he swore to destroy. He says that such a bank as currently exists only stands to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, and that the government is not necessarily evil, however that it requires confinement to avoid the potential abuses of its people. One such way that the national bank's power was reduced was through the Distribution Act of 1836, in which revenue that would go towards the power-hungry bank instead was distributed to smaller state entities. This shows how President Jackson wished to help the common man by removing one of the elite's holds on power, the national bank. The 7th President of the United States was very concerned about the ways that the government imposed taxes and tariffs. After all, they were one of the key reasons that the country was even created in the first place. This conviction was put to the test in a major part of Andrew Jackson's crusade against the national bank and its allies, when he compromised with the Tariff of 1828. This tax, also known as the Tariff of Abominations, was created to protect American industry from foreign production, but in doing so hurt the individual states that didn't need its interference. One such state, South Carolina, was so infuriated that they attempted to nullify the tax on their own, sparking an additional conflict, the nullification crisis. Their reasoning for this action was seen in Document 4, where Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina told the country why their nullification was for the best. He said that such an unjust law, no matter the cost, is against the very spirit of America, especially when it hurts the common Southerner. This strong argument was only part of what prompted Andrew Jackson to make a compromise on the tariff. He tried to lessen its power through reducing the tax amount, but ultimately failed, as his reduction was simply not enough. In the end, however, his efforts only show his conviction to the protection of the common American. Not only did President Andrew Jackson wish to reduce the power of the wealthy, but he also wanted to increase the power of the common man. This was one of the staple ideas of the United States, equal opportunity. However, while the rich kept all of the money, there would be little opportunity for the common people to rise up. A parallel of this was seen between the races in Document 1, where French historian Alexis de Tocqueville states that the first thing he noticed about American democracy was that it only included the males of European descent. He goes on to say that other races were kept down by this group, most of whom Andrew Jackson called the common men. This group of common men were also kept down by their equivalent force, the American system. This system was Alexander Hamilton's idea of an improved America in which the national bank held money, tariffs protected national industries, and federal dollars were spent towards infrastructure. In the end, however, it only consolidated power in the elite and kept the common people from rising up, which Andrew Jackson sought to end through dividing the national bank's wealth to multiple different state banks and giving the states additional powers. Through these efforts, Andrew Jackson aided the common man by returning the power once held only by the federal government back to the people. In the end, President Andrew Jackson's Bank War helped the common American by reducing the power of the wealthy, not giving in to harmful tariffs, and by giving power back to the common man. While the conflicts may have been hard, the ultimate outcome of the Bank War helped the American common man for years to come. Although Andrew Jackson was able to appeal to the common man through the Bank War and Indian Removal Acts, with the nullification crisis he actually went against the common man, politically and economically. This can be seen by the high tariffs that were put on imports that went against the common man. Jackson's Tariff of 1828 is a direct result as to why Jackson wasn't an advocate to the common man. The Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations, was a tariff that Congress passed on May 19, 1828. What this tariff did was tax British imports to make the idea of buying from American manufacturers a lot more feasible. They put it into place to protect the industry of the northern parts of the United States. What it ended up doing is making most Southerners mad because they were the ones that mostly bought materials from the Europeans to make their own goods. This in turn made the people start calling it the Tariff of Abominations. Eventually, John Calhoun came in and proposed the doctrine of nullification. Eventually, this led to a compromise tariff in 1833, which eventually led to peace. In direct rebellion of the high tariff on imports, the Whig Party was formed. This party was formed in opposition of the policies of Andrew Jackson. The Whig Party mostly supported what the Congress had to offer instead of Jackson. They were also huge supporters of modernization and economic protectionism. They had their name because the word Whig had a reputation for being an opposing tyranny. This all went against President Jackson and the common man. In the end, the party was eliminated by a debate on whether to give the allowance of expanding slavery to new territories. Finally, the American system went against Jackson's presidency and him being an advocate for the common man. The American system was basically an ideal economic plan for a lot of people. The big reason that it went against the common man was in the high tariffs that it had said to put in place. This system was a new type of federalism that was made up of a high tariff that was placed on imports, maintenance of public land that had high prices to give the government more money, keeping the Bank of the United States, improvement of roads, canals, etc., and the tariff was the biggest thing that went against the common man, especially economically. In the end, when we look at it, Andrew Jackson was not an economic and political advocate to the common man through the nullification crisis. Overall, it is easy to see why Andrew Jackson was and is considered to be a hero of the common American. His strides made with the Indian Removal Act, nullification crisis, and bank war show the story all too well. It is most certainly because of this attitude and effectiveness that Andrew Jackson has gone down in history as one of the most prominent American presidents ever.